Imagine waking up one day and the person you once shared everything with simply vanishes. No trace, no explanation. For months, I've been living with the unanswered questions surrounding my ex's sudden disappearance. Today, I'm finally revealing the truth about what I found, and trust me, it's far stranger than you could ever imagine. I didn't intend to tell this story to anyone but myself, tucked away in the corner of a crowded coffee shop, listening to the hiss of the espresso machine and the distant hum of a city that never truly paused. But the more I spoke into my journal, the more I realized that the truth wasn't mine to keep anymore. It belonged to the people who asked questions, who wanted a map through the fog. Maybe, by telling you, I could lay down some of the fear that has pressed on my chest like a tight lid. Her name was Mara, though everyone who knew us called her Ray. Ray had a way of making rooms feel larger than they were, as if she carried a window seat with her wherever she walked. Her laughter could travel through a crowded subway car and land softly on the ears of strangers who needed to believe in a good ending. We met in a ruined bookstore that smelled of rain and old secrets, a place that seemed to exist outside time, where books waited for someone brave enough to listen to their quiet, patient stories. It wasn't love at first sight, not exactly. It was a sparking recognition, as if two halves of a weather system had finally collided and decided to storm together. We built a life in fits and starts, late-night subway rides, cheap ramen that somehow tasted like feasts, art shows where Ray's eyes glittered with something between mischief and devotion. We didn't argue often, and when we did, it was over the smallest things. The music she would hum while I spoke, the way I folded laundry, the coffee she preferred with a touch of cinnamon that made me suspicious of its warmth. In the early days, I believed the perfect version of Ray existed only in our apartment, a kind of private mythology we worshipped together. The truth, of course, is that every romance hides a few creaking floorboards. The evening she disappeared began like any other ordinary moment, a Sunday when the city's breath felt shallow and the air carried a faint taste of rain even though the sky promised nothing. Ray woke early, as she often did, not to blaze a trail of plans but to quiet the clock that ticked away at our shared future. She brewed coffee so strong it could wake the dead, and she studied the window as if the neighborhood outside could be coaxed into revealing its deepest secrets with the right stare. We talked about nothing and everything, our next trip, a new project she wanted to start, the way the corner bakery always burned its croissants in the same places, as if fate had a sense of humor. It was a morning of ordinary rituals until it wasn't. I stepped into the shower, and when I stepped back out, Ray was gone. No note. No message. Not even a shadow left to tell me where she had gone. The apartment was in the exact state it had been in when I left for the shower, mugs on the counter, an open notebook with doodles in the margins, Ray's favorite scarf draped over the chair as if she had just stepped out for a moment and would return with a story to tell. The police called it a person missing, not a disappearance. They asked if there had been any threats, any fights, any new rivals in Ray's life. I could only shake my head because there hadn't been. Ray wore no costume of secrets. She wore the truth like a cloak, even when it was making her look vulnerable, even when the truth might have frightened her into obscurity. In the days that followed, I searched for her in every corner of the city we had explored together. The narrow lanes behind the old cinema where we first held hands, the graffiti-covered bridge where Ray claimed the river whispered to those who listened, the little bookstore where we first argued about which author deserved the last page. I questioned baristas who remembered her, couriers who had once delivered packages to our door, dog walkers who claimed Ray spoke to the dogs as if they understood a deeper grammar of human longing. The city, in its vast memory, started to feel like Ray's map, a labyrinth she had carefully drawn and then left for me to decipher. But there was no deciphering to be done without Ray's own steps. The first real clue came not from a person, but from a place Ray had always kept a quiet attachment to, a small, undecorated studio above a shuttered bakery on a street that most people forgot existed. It had belonged to Ray's grandmother, who had died years earlier, leaving behind a half-finished painting and a stack of letters tied with a red ribbon. Ray would go there on Sundays, she told me, to listen to the paint dry and decide which color the world deserved that week. When I finally dared to go through Ray's things, I found the letters. They were addressed to a woman named Lila, a name I didn't recognize, but whose handwriting mimicked Ray's in a way that felt like a memory wearing Ray's skin. The letters spoke of a shared knowledge, a pact, a plan to meet somewhere she called the border crossing at dusk, where the river runs cold and certain truths can't survive the daylight. The language was tender, almost religious, and it hinted at a partner Ray kept private, someone who knew her as deeply as Ray knew herself. The more I read, the more I realized Ray had a different life in parallel to the one I knew, a life that was not a betrayal but a different kind of honesty, the kind that requires risk, secrecy, and the courage to step outside a plan you've built with another person. It wasn't that Ray loved me less, it was that she loved something else more, the possibility that a secret truth could redeem a whole person she kept hidden from the world and from me. The letters spoke of the border crossing as a shared ritual, a chance to leave behind the noise of the living and meet the quiet of what remained when people stopped pretending to be whole. I followed the clues with the stubbornness of someone who has nothing left but a stubborn heart. The border crossing, as described in the letters, wasn't a place but a moment, an intersection at the river, where two currents meet and decide to forget the banks that define them. I found a map tucked inside the grandmother's painting, a sketch Ray had drawn with a careful hand, marking a route that would take me to a remote train station on the city's edge, to a platform that looked as if it had waited for decades for someone to sit on its forgotten bench and listen to the train sigh its old song. The map was not a trap but a breadcrumb, a strange invitation to follow a chorus of air that had once hummed Ray's presence into existence. I spent nights on buses and trains, chasing a rumor of Ray's steps more than Ray herself. People I spoke with claimed to have seen her at odd hours, always alone, always with a small, weathered notebook clutched tightly in her hand. Some said she spoke softly to herself, as if reciting lines from a script only she could hear. Others claimed she looked brighter, less afraid, in the late hours, as though the city's shadows had become a stage on which she could perform the truth she was seeking. The more I pushed, the more I realized Ray's disappearance was not a random event but a deliberate one, a choice she had made to escape a life that had grown too loud, too crowded with expectations and old ghosts. The turning point came in a warehouse district near the river, where the city's noise dissolved into a thin, metallic whisper. There, I found a rooftop with a view of the water, an overlook Ray had described in a letter as where the living parts with the dead for a breath. The river carried a smell of iron and rain, and the wind carried with it a phrase Ray often used when she wanted to remind herself she was still alive. The truth is a map, not a sentence. On the rooftop lay a photograph, weathered around the edges, of Ray standing with a woman I had never seen in any other photo, Lila. They stood with their backs to the camera, facing the river, sharing a look that suggested mutual trust and shared burden. On the back of the photo, in Ray's careful handwriting, were words I would come to recognize as a vow. If you read this, you've earned a ticket to the border crossing. Beneath it, a single sentence that felt like a hinge of fate. Meet me where the river forgets. The river forgets in the way memory forgets names when you're tired and the world is heavy with rain. It erases nothing but makes you believe in the possibility of erasure. Ray had not vanished into nothing. She had chosen a new form of existence that would allow her to tell the truth at a scale I couldn't comprehend from the life we'd built together. Lila, I learned, was Ray's childhood confidant in a way I could never have become. Lila had disappeared from Ray's life for reasons Ray kept to herself, but the letters suggested Lila remained tethered to Ray by a different kind of bond. One that wasn't about romance or friendship but about the memory of a shared longing to become something better than the sum of their parts. Ray's plan, as I began to understand, wasn't to escape the past but to reassemble it into a form that could survive scrutiny. She wanted to reveal, in the only way she knew how, that the past wasn't fixed. It could be rearranged, reinterpreted, and finally, accepted. The truth I uncovered wasn't a single moment of certainty but a chain of small revelations that, when strung together, created a delicate lattice of meaning. Ray's disappearance was tied to a project she had been quietly pursuing with Lila and, perhaps, others who believed that the world needed a different kind of truth-telling. Ray had become involved with a group that collects and preserves stories, the ones people tell themselves when the world refuses to listen. They called themselves the Quiet Archive, a name that sounded more like a rumor than a movement. Their mission was to preserve truths that institutions often refuse to acknowledge. Stories of people who vanished, stories of trauma that remains unspoken, stories that exist at the margins and refuse to disappear. Ray wasn't running from me. She was running toward a more honest version of life where no one would be erased by silence. I found the archive itself not in a grand building with marble stairs, but in a tiny, unassuming storefront that looked more like a basement than a temple. Inside, shelves crowded with notebooks, tape reels, and folders labeled with names that meant nothing to most people. It was quiet in a way that felt sacred, the kind of quiet you hear when the air itself holds its breath. Ray's notes were there, tucked between a photograph of a couple who disappeared on a seaside road and a letter addressed to a man who had once been a detective, a letter that began with an apology and ended with an invitation to a conversation that could never happen in daylight. The process of assembling Ray's truth required me to listen to the sounds she had learned to live with: the creak of the floorboards, the scratch of a pencil against a page, the distant murmur of a city that forgets its sorrows only to remember them again at night. What Ray did was not to reveal a single scandal but to illuminate a pattern: how people vanish into the spaces between institutions and relationships, how the unexplained can be a form of resilience, how truth can require time and courage to bloom. The Quiet Archive didn't seek sensational displays. It sought to create a map for other people who might one day find themselves in Ray's position. They worked with the families left behind, with investigators who still believed in the possibility that a disappearance could be solved not by force or fear, but by patient listening and the willingness to hold two truths at once. Ray was gone in the sense that she was changing, and Ray was here in the sense that her choices would still shape the lives of the people she left behind. As I read Ray's final notes, I realized that the truth about her disappearance wasn't a single secret she kept from me but a mosaic that required the presence of many voices to be completed. The notes described an upcoming public event, an oral history project that would bring together witnesses, lovers, rivals, and strangers who had felt Ray's impact in different ways. It would be a night when the city itself would stand as a witness to her life and the stories she carried, a night when the river would be reinforced by the voices of those who refused to let silence decide their fate. Ray wanted to reveal the truth in a manner that honored the complexity of human lives, quietly, respectfully, and with a sense of responsibility to those who would come after us to ask their own questions. So I prepared for that night, not knowing what I would say or how the city would respond. I practiced saying Ray's name as if it were a hymn, a reminder that love does not end when someone disappears, but transforms into something more durable than fear or rumor. When the night arrived, the city gathered in a hall that smelled of old wood and rain, a place that looked like a shipwright's workshop that had learned to dream. People shared their memories in a sequence that felt like a chorus, each voice adding a note that felt both intimate and universal. I spoke at length about Ray and about the letters, and about the border crossing that had become a metaphor for a life that refuses to be reduced to one version of truth. I spoke about the Quiet Archive, about how it taught me to listen to the quiet places where truth hides and to resist the urge to rush toward a neat conclusion. I spoke about the pain of longing and the strange relief of knowing that a person's absence can become a force for something larger than the self. As the night wore on, I understood that Ray's disappearance was not a defeat but a decision to pursue a form of honesty that required the presence of others, people who could witness, validate, and hold accountable the stories that would otherwise wither away in the dark. The final act of the evening was a reading from Ray's notebook, a passage she had written to Lila, but which now belonged to all of us in the room. A vow to keep faith with the truth even when the truth is fragile, a commitment to let go of the illusion that one person can carry all the weight of another's life. It wasn't the confession of a scandal, it was a pledge to honor the fact that human beings are more than their shadows and that the best way to honor someone who disappears is to ensure that their truth can travel beyond the confines of a single relationship. After the event, I wandered along the river under a sky that had learned to forgive. The lights on the water trembled like the tremors of a heart attempting to steady itself after a long tremor of fear. Ray's absence still pressed on me, but it no longer burned with the intensity of unanswered questions. Instead, it felt like a door left ajar, a passage through which the truth could walk if we allowed it to, a truth that included both love and loss, both memory and possibility. Ray hadn't disappeared into nothingness. She had retreated into a form of truth that required time, cooperation, and a community of listening ears. She had, in effect, given me a new lens through which to see our shared past and the lives of others who had been touched by her presence. In the weeks that followed, I continued to work with the Quiet Archive, helping to collect testimonies, organize records, and guide new families through the maze of questions that arise when someone you love vanishes. The process didn't erase the ache, but it gave the ache a purpose. It allowed Ray's memory to become a beacon for other people who needed validation, a compass for communities learning to tell honest stories about loss, trauma, and resilience. I still wake up sometimes with the exact moment Ray left echoing in the room, a memory that feels like the first line of a long, winding story. And I still carry her notebook, the one filled with careful handwriting and the scent of old rain, the same notebook that bore the marker for the border crossing. When I touch it, I feel Ray's presence not as a ghost but as a hand guiding me toward more truth, more care, and a deeper understanding of what it means to love someone who has chosen to redefine themselves through disappearance. If you're listening to this and you've ever found yourself entangled in a disappearance that defies the logic of your own questions, I want you to hear this. Truth isn't a single answer you can pin down and present to the world. It is a living thing, something you assemble with care, patience, and the willingness to listen to voices that must be heard even when they speak softly or in secret. Ray's truth, in its strange, almost dreamlike courage, grew from a belief that the world can bear more honesty than it often does, a belief that the act of disappearing can also be the act of choosing a different way to exist in the aftermath of a life you once shared with someone else. Ray's truth is not a verdict. It's a map that continues to unfold as new stories arrive, new memories are shared, and new witnesses step forward to say, "We remember, and we will keep listening." And so I tell this story now not to claim the final word on what happened to Ray, but to honor the impulses that guided her, curiosity, compassion, and an unyielding commitment to truth in all its messy, imperfect glory. If you take only one thing from what I've learned, let it be this: disappearance